Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to part 4 of the 7.1 lecture. This section is going to focus on the unification of Germany, which is arguably the most significant political development in the second half of the 19th century in Europe. So, as always, we're going to start with a little bit of contextualization, reminding us of what has taken place in the German states in the first half of the century. What are some of the foundations that we've already encountered for German unification? Well, like I've said in every other section, the revolutions of 1848 are a really important event in European history in the 19th century, mostly because it marks the end of the age of Metternich and a lot of the sort of romantic political forces, and then allows for the introduction of the more realistic, realpolitik style of leading. So in the German states, the 1848 revolutions had led to the development of the Frankfurt Assembly. Also, influenced by the revolution in France, the Frankfurt Assembly was essentially a loose parliamentary body with representatives of the various German states who hoped to facilitate the unification of the German states and attempted to write a constitution. Now, of course, there were many conflicts in the Frankfurt Assembly, middle class versus lower class values, moderate versus radical values. There was also a conflict over whether or not to include Austria in this new united Germany. And ultimately, the Frankfurt Assembly was unsuccessful in creating any meaningful change because the Prussian king at the time, Frederick William IV, refused the offer to be the Emperor of Germany. And so that essentially brought an end to any developments that may have come from 1848. So after 1848, as we get into the second half of the 19th century, it is clear that Prussia and Austria were the only German states that were powerful enough to dominate German affairs. Remember, there were about 39 different German states in the German Confederation. And for most of the century, Austria had controlled the German Confederation, but they lacked the same authority and power that they had had in the first half of the century now that they had lost Metternich as one of their big leaders. And as Austria starts to decline in its political power, Prussia is looking to increase its political power and influence in the German Confederation. You might also remember that Prussia had established the Zollverein earlier in the century. The Zollverein was a German customs union, essentially an economic union, that had been formed in 1834. It eliminated tariffs and tolls between different German states in the Confederation, which allowed for increased prosperity, and it stimulated trade. This essentially was an economic unification of those early German states, beginning first with Prussia and then expanding to more and more German states. And the purpose of this was to allow for economic growth and to support industrialization in the German states. Eventually, all states in the German Confederation except Austria belonged to this union. In fact, Austria tried several times to destroy the Zollverein, although, of course, it was unsuccessful. And the existence of the Zollverein actually encouraged the idea of the Kleindeutsch German unification plan. So you might remember that one of the areas of disagreement in the Frankfurt Assembly was whether or not to include Austria. That was essentially the Kleindeutsch versus Grossdeutsch argument. Kleindeutsch means small Germany without Austria. Grossdeutsch means big Germany with Austria. Well, because Austria was declining in its power and influence, and also because Austria had not participated in the Zollverein, this altogether encouraged the idea of the Kleindeutsch plan. A unified Germany without Austria was now seen as the most practical means of unification among various German states, especially Prussia. Now, in 1861, Prussia will have a new king, William I. William I is over here on your left. This is his portrait. Please take a moment to admire his very impressive mutton chops that you see there. Now, William I wanted to expand Prussia and also reform its military. He, was sort of like Frederick the Great in that he wanted to expand Prussia's greatness as much as possible. And so he wanted to double the size of the Prussian army by making 3 years of compulsory military service for all young men. However, the Prussian parliament by the 1860s was increasingly controlled by the middle class, and we know the middle class tended to be more liberal. And these middle class liberals in the parliament feared William I's executive power and the growth of the military, and they especially did not like the compulsory service component because they felt that was unnecessarily authoritarian. And so Parliament rejected the king's suggested military budget in 1862, essentially snubbing the king politically. But William I was not going to take this slight. He was not going to accept Parliament's attempt to overrule him. And so in reaction to this, William I is going to appoint a new prime minister for Prussia. And this new prime minister is probably one of the most famous and influential European politicians of all time, and that is none other than Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck, very important, very influential, someone you absolutely should know. He is a master politician and the ultimate realpolitik. Like if you look up realpolitik in the dictionary, you will see his picture next to the definition. Bismarck essentially determined the course of modern German history and, to some extent, modern European history as well. He is the one who leads the drive and orchestrates a Germany unified under Prussia and the Hohenzollern dynasty. Before he became the prime minister, he had extensive experience as a diplomat, which gave him very well-developed knowledge of European affairs and the different leaders of different European states. And Bismarck was very practical and opportunistic. He took advantage of events as they emerged. He carefully considered options, and again, he was very much a Machiavellian politician as a realpolitik leader. Now, Bismarck was also conservative, very traditionally conservative in a lot of ways. He was from the Junker class, which you might remember are the aristocrats of Prussia, so he's a conservative aristocrat. Bismarck did not understand, nor did he trust, liberalism, socialism, or democracy. He was primarily motivated by nationalism and conservatism. He was very sure of himself and his opinions and his actions. He strongly disliked anyone who opposed him. And he saw the unification of Germany actually as secondary to expanding the power of Prussia. His primary goal was to expand the power of Prussia, and if doing that meant unifying Germany, then so be it. Bismarck's ideology and attitude is perhaps best demonstrated by the following speech he made, by the following quote from the speech he made. "It is not by speeches and majority votes are the great questions of the day decided. That was the great error of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron." So if anything, write down blood and iron. That is what really represents Bismarck and his attitude and his beliefs and his tactics for political power. So now as the prime minister, Bismarck will pursue military reform. He will continue to pursue military reform, doubling the size of the army, and implementing compulsory military service, and he then blames the liberals for the breakdown of the government. So Bismarck comes to the parliament again in 1868 with a new budget that, quite frankly, wasn't that different from the last budget in 1862, knowing that the liberals will likely reject this new budget, which they do. And this leads to a complete stalemate in the government, right? The government basically ceases to function because the prime minister and the parliament are not able to work together to make anything happen. Now, Bismarck argues that the Prussian constitution had what is called a gap. This is called the gap theory, saying that in the event of a stalemate, the prime minister has the authority to override parliament to make sure the government continues to function. Now, the Constitution didn't explicitly say that, but it didn't explicitly not say that either. So Bismarck used this essential gap to move forward with his political goals. So he overrides Parliament, and he begins to collect taxes to support this military budget and reform the military anyway, regardless of what Parliament has to say. So Parliament is essentially rendered useless. And Bismarck, for all intents and purposes, will govern Prussia independently as the sole executive power from 1862 to 1866. Now, to distract the people from this domestic stalemate, Bismarck pursued a very active foreign policy. He continued to expand the Prussian military. He initiated several wars, small wars, with nearby rivals that played upon nationalistic sympathies, because these small wars did a lot to generate nationalistic spirit in Prussia and the German states, and also to encourage loyalty to Prussia. We will see that each of his wars are very carefully orchestrated. They are very deliberate. Each one sort of sets up the next one. And Bismarck, always, as a realpolitik, always made sure his enemy was isolated before attacking, right? So he did his homework. He made sure there were no pesky alliances that would make things messy. He made sure that if he ever entered a war, he knew from the start of it that Prussia would win. So there are basically 3 wars that Bismarck will create, and each one is an important step into German unification. So let's start first with the Danish War. So the Danish War refers specifically to a war between Prussia and Denmark. Denmark, you might remember, is a Scandinavian country on a peninsula coming out of the north of Germany into the North Sea there. And at the base of that peninsula were these provinces called Schleswig and Holstein. Don't worry about having to pronounce those. In 1863, Denmark moved to incorporate these duchies, these provinces of Schleswig and Holstein, meaning that Denmark basically said, these provinces now belong to Denmark. They are claiming these provinces as their own. However, this outraged German nationalists because these regions had large German populations. They were German-speaking, they had German culture, they identified as Germans. So for all intents and purposes, Schleswig-Holstein were considered to be German states. So this is an opportunity that Bismarck uses for war, right? Bismarck did not necessarily provoke Denmark into making this move, but since Denmark did make this move, this is a great excuse for Bismarck to go to war. So Bismarck persuaded Austria to join Prussia in a war against Denmark, again arguing that Prussia and Austria needed to team up to protect German identity and German pride. Now, the goal here was not actually the defeat of Denmark. Bismarck's long-term goal in all of this was to isolate Austria from German affairs, and he realized that this arrangement would actually help him pursue this goal. And you may be wondering, like, how does that work? How is forming an alliance with Austria to fight Denmark going to help isolate Austria? Well, just be patient, because Bismarck knows what he's doing. Obviously, Prussia and Austria together quickly defeated Denmark, so the war itself is fairly insignificant, but it's the outcome of the war that matters. Because Prussia and Austria allied to defeat Denmark, Bismarck proposed a joint administration of Schleswig-Holstein, meaning Prussia would manage part of the province and Austria would manage the other part. This is sort of like two siblings sharing a bedroom. And if you have a sibling and you've ever shared a bedroom, you might recognize that there are lots of opportunities for conflict in that scenario. And that's what Bismarck basically realized as well, that this joint administration was an opportunity to ultimately intensify the rivalry between Prussia and Austria. And soon, disputes arose over rites of passage, the keeping of internal order, tax collection, things like that. Because the Danish War was really only a pretense for Bismarck to eventually go to war with Austria in order to isolate Austria from German affairs. And so that's what leads to the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Now, the tensions on Schleswig-Holstein are what will ultimately lead to the Austro-Prussian War 2 years later. But before Prussia attacks Austria, Bismarck is going to make sure that Austria is totally isolated. He's going to go around to some of the other major states, Russia, France, Italy, Britain, and make sure that they will all remain neutral in this conflict. For Britain, this was a no-brainer. Britain had been following a policy of non-intervention on the continent for quite some time now. So they're like, do whatever you want, Prussia. Russia was really, really pissed off at Austria still for the Crimean War. So Russia was like, please, yes, defeat Austria, go to war, invade them, destroy them. Can we watch? Can we take pictures? So Russia was like all for this. Obviously, they're not going to intervene at all. Italy was willing to remain neutral because Italy not only had no love for Austria historically, but also Bismarck promised that if Italy stayed neutral, that if he defeated Austria, he would give Venetia back to Italy. So Venetia, remember, was one of the few provinces that Austria still occupied. And France was basically totally preoccupied with their Mexican adventure and other domestic issues, so he didn't have to worry about France for right now. Because remember, the 1860s are not as good for Napoleon III in France. Anyways, like I said, now that Austria is totally isolated, the joint administration of the Schleswig-Holstein provinces led to the excuse for war. What's interesting is most of Europe actually expected Austria to win this war because throughout the 19th century, Austria was the traditional powerhouse. However, Prussia's use of railroads to mass troops and the use of their new breech-loading rifle, which you can see illustrated in the drawing to your left there, proved superior to Austria's military efforts. And Prussia didn't just win the war, they defeated Austria in only 7 weeks. So this is also sometimes called the 7 Weeks' War. So it was a quick and decisive defeat of Austria. Now, Bismarck did not want to make a permanent enemy of Austria, right? He needed Austria to be isolated and removed from German affairs, but he didn't want Austria to develop a long-term grudge. So his peace treaty was actually quite generous with Austria, again, because he didn't want to make them a hostile enemy. So, for example, he didn't require them to pay much, if any, reparations. He didn't require them to give up much territory beyond Venetia, which had been promised to the Italians. Primarily, he just wanted Austria to agree that they would stay out of German affairs. So this would allow Prussia to then lead the unification of the German states under the Hohenzollern dynasty. So the next year, in 1867, the German states north of the main river were organized into a new North German Confederation. So that's basically the states in the northern part of the German Confederation. They unified into this new North German Confederation led by Prussia. Some of the southern states, which were largely Catholic, were still independent. They had not yet joined under Prussia's leadership, but they were still connected economically through the Zollverein. Now, one of the ways Bismarck was able to persuade many of the other German states to support Prussia and unify was not only through the sort of nationalistic sympathies he had cultivated in these wars, but also he promised universal male suffrage for the elections to the Reichstag, which was the lower house of parliament. He did so in writing a new constitution. In this new constitution for the North German Confederation, many German states were able to retain their local governments and retain some political autonomy, although the Prussian king and chancellor, as Bismarck was now known as, had total executive power, meaning they controlled the army and they controlled foreign policy. However, all the German states were able to have some participation in the government through the new bicameral legislature, which was made up of two houses, the Reichstag and the Bundesrat. And the Reichstag had universal male suffrage for its elections. This new government structure ultimately gave Bismarck the ability to circumvent the middle class by appealing directly to the working classes, much like Napoleon III had done in France. Again, you may be wondering, why would someone who was traditionally conservative encourage universal male suffrage, which is a traditionally very radical idea? Well, it's because by allying with the working class, by showing the working class that he is on their side, Bismarck is able to secure his own political power, much like Napoleon III did. So this partial unification is obviously an important turning point in Prussian domestic affairs, going back to that original conflict between Bismarck and the parliament. Throughout the past 4 years and the military victories, Bismarck had finally gained the support of liberals in the parliament, and these liberals legalized the taxes that Bismarck had been collecting for the past 4 years. And were now full supporters of Bismarck because he had shown how he was able to make Prussia this powerful nation, and he used nationalism as a unifying force. And that's, again, a key component of him as a realpolitik. Bismarck used nationalism to win support from liberals and avoid any serious government reform. And so Bismarck, more than anything, demonstrated a clear separation between nationalism and liberalism. He is basically responsible for conservatism adopting and embracing nationalism as one of their defining ideologies. And, this might make you think of future German politics and the rise of the Nazi Party and how they are ultimately a very nationalistic political movement. More on that later, of course. So that brings us almost to the third and final war. First, I want to show you this map here. This map demonstrates the stages of German unification, right? So the blue territory, that's the Kingdom of Prussia as of 1865. The light and darker green territory here, that goes to about this area, these are states that would join the North German Confederation in 1867. And then the yellow regions, these are the southern German states that are primarily Catholic, they would join the full German Empire after our next war in 1871. So this next and final war is the Franco-Prussian War. Now, before Bismarck could unify the entire German Confederation and establish a new German Empire, he had to deal with France. Bismarck recognized that France would never approve of a German empire and that they would intervene to stop this unification. Quite frankly, if you think back to what we have learned in this course, French foreign policy has focused on keeping Germany disunified for centuries. Think about all those rivalries between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, right? Or even before them, the Valois. the wars of Francis I and Charles V. France had always focused on keeping Germany decentralized. Think of course, the Reformation. Think of the 30 Years' War. That has always been the case. And also, right now in French history, in the late 1860s, Napoleon III was desperate for a military victory to offset his numerous domestic problems. By the late 1860s, Napoleon III's popularity was declining in France. He had had many foreign policy disasters, and so he was a little trigger happy in terms of going to war to try to restore his legitimacy as a ruler. So Bismarck knew this. Bismarck recognized that Napoleon III would be eager to go to war. And Bismarck also knew that a war with France would ultimately frighten those remaining southern German states into unification so they could finally become the German Empire. So all Bismarck had to do was wait for an opportunity, right? As a realpolitik, he just has to wait for an opportunity to present itself. And that opportunity presented itself in 1870, when there was yet another controversy over Spanish succession. So basically what had happened is the Spanish throne was once again vacant. The Hohenzollern dynasty, meaning the Prussian monarchy, had initially been offered the Spanish throne because they were connected by being cousins or something like that. Because the Spanish Revolution had recently deposed the last Bourbon queen of Spain for that time period. And so potentially here's an opportunity for the Hohenzollern dynasty to control Germany and Spain, right? But of course, France is going to strongly oppose this. France does not want the Hohenzollern dynasty to control Germany and Spain, because that means that France would be surrounded by Germans potentially. So the French opposed this potential unification. William I acquiesced, he backed off, but then France demanded a formal apology and a promise that Germany would never, ever consider taking the Spanish throne. And this was really kind of an overreach on France's part, that they were so demanding that not only did Germany refuse the Spanish throne, but they apologized for even considering it. That's a little bit much. So here's the opportunity for Bismarck. And this is an event known as the Ems Dispatch. It's just EMS, the Eames or the Ems, I think it's Eames, the Eames Dispatch. The Eames Dispatch is when Bismarck actually edited a telegram to France to make it seem more insulting than it actually was. And in doing this, he knew that the French government would get so angry that they would go ahead and declare war on Prussia, right? So again, here's Bismarck, the realpolitik master. He is going to fake a telegram just to piss off Napoleon III, because he knows Napoleon III is so trigger happy that he would gladly go to war with Prussia. So France declares war on Prussia in July of 1870, which is a huge mistake because Prussia is honestly now a military beast. Bismarck had spent the past decade at this point building up his new well-equipped, well-trained army, right? They had this huge military. And remember, the sort of traditional militaristic culture of Germany established centuries ago by Frederick William. This also meant that the South German states joined with the North, and France is isolated. France is isolated, and they are now single-handedly facing the biggest military power in Europe. On September 2nd of 1870, just maybe 2 months later, the majority of the French army surrenders at the Battle of Sedan. This was a humiliating defeat for France, as Napoleon III was taken prisoner by the Prussians. This also led essentially to the collapse of the Second French Empire. And even though Paris refused to surrender, Paris refused to surrender and was under siege by the Prussians until January of 1871. Right, but even so, this was a relatively easy victory for the Germans against the French, and the relative ease with which the Germans defeated France sent shockwaves throughout Europe. I mean, Europe was shocked that the Germans were able to defeat France so easily. So the peace treaty of this war is known as the Treaty of Frankfurt. And unlike Austria, where Bismarck was quite generous because he didn't want to make an enemy of Austria, Bismarck does not hold that same empathy for France. He knows that Germany and France will always be enemies, and rightly so. And so in this treaty, France has to pay big time. Bismarck demands reparations of over 5 billion francs, which was about $1 billion in today's currency. This was an unprecedented amount of reparations requested in any war in Europe. France was also forced to give up some of their most valuable territory. Go back one slide here. You can see this little orange territory here. It's Alsace and Lorraine. This was one of their most industrially rich provinces, one of the most profitable provinces, and these provinces had to be given up to Germany. And this in particular is what led to lots of long-term resentment and distrust that the French had against the Germans. And so, on January 18th, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, King William I is declared the head of the Second German Empire. Now, the reason they call it the Second German Empire is because they believed that the First German Empire was, in fact, the Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages. At this point, the southern German states had agreed to enter the Confederation, and all of the German states, except Austria, had now unified under Prussian leadership. So William I is the first German emperor, and Bismarck continues to be his right-hand man as the chancellor. This demonstrates the ultimate triumph of authoritarian and militaristic values. Germany is now inarguably the strongest power on the continent. Like I said, the unification of Germany sends shockwaves across Europe. This is a major, major development in 19th century political history. This will ultimately change the next 70 years, right, of modern European history. And I'd also like to point out, look at how insulting this is. The German Empire is declared, it is unified in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Think about the significance of Versailles to French history. And the Hall of Mirrors is the biggest, most beautiful room, the most famous room in Versailles, and that is where the Germans ultimately decide to declare their empire. And here you have a very poor resolution image of the German declaration of their empire. So again, this is the Second German Empire. We will learn later in the course about the Third German Empire, or Third Reich, under Hitler and the Nazi Party. Now that brings an end to part 4 of our 7.1 lecture series. Coming up next is part 5, a very short piece on developments in Austria and Hungary.